Welcome, everybody, to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We're on part 34 today. We're going to continue what we started last week in discussing an age beyond Christendom. And this section is kind of a setup for the last part of the season. We're going to be talking about events that happened in the church throughout the 18th century to the present. So you're going to get a lot of history that you're probably pretty familiar with, and definitely things that directly impact denominations and churches in the West, and also worldwide for that matter, going into modern times in maybe even more direct way than anything else we've looked at. So I think this is going to be a good ending point as we finish out the history of Christianity. We still have probably about 12 weeks to go. So that's going to get us into the first part of next year. But it's going to be good, and look forward to going through the rest of it with you. So let's jump into this today. The relative peace of the 19th century in Europe was possible in part because competition among European powers took the form of colonial expansion. So there wasn't really a whole lot to fight over on the actual European continent. What was being fought over was taking place in other places, very far away. So there wasn't a need to really get in any kind of dispute there. Back at home, you were out to try to conquer other areas. And so there's a competition, but there's not open armed conflict. But by 1914, most of the territories of Asia, Africa, and Latin America had been colonized. So it can't last because eventually all that's going to be over with. And now it's time to come back home and start focusing on what's going on there. Europe then turned its attention to its own southeastern region, the Balkans, where the progressive breakup of the Turkish Empire had created a number of states with unstable boundaries and governments. So they come home and they say, oh, wait a minute, we forgot about the Balkans. Here's an area that we can expand into. Oh, wait, everybody wants to do that. So there's going to be this conflict is going to come back into play. Those lands became the bone of contention among European powers, and it was out of that contention that World War I emerged. And, you look at it and you think, well, we keep calling this World War this, World War that. It's really just these European countries that were involved in it. And even World War II, yeah, you had Japan, but most of the nations involved for both sides were going to be the United States, obviously, but then the European continent and Great Britain. So why would it be considered a world war? The very technological and industrial progress of the West would then be seen in all of its destructive power. So all this great technology and advancements that happened, now it was, being looked at as being used in a good way. Now it's going to be used in a bad way. And people are going to see the underbelly of what was created. There's actually some bad stuff that can happen with it too. They're going to get a big time dose of it between this one and the next big war that's coming. The control the industrial powers had over the control the industrial powers had over distant lands meant that most of the planet was directly or indirectly involved in the conflict. So because of these colonies being all over the world, these forces, these nations that were at war with one another in Europe, it's going to affect these other countries too, because they're going to need supplies from them. They're going to need people to come fight. They're going to need them to be involved. So it's called a world war because it did affect the entire world. And the world was either directly or indirectly involved in this war that took place in Europe, which is going to be one of the reasons that there's going to be a turning away from Western culture and civilization, because I'm over here in Asia. I don't have anything to do with what you're fighting about. I don't care anything about it, but yet I'm being sucked into it. And that's not going to be looked favorably upon, which it shouldn't have been. Following the war, it was hoped that the League of Nations would be able to prevent a repetition of the tragic events of World War I, but the growth of fascism rendered such hopes futile. So we'll get into more of this in a moment, but we know the seeds of World War II were sown at the conclusion of World War I. But before we look at that, we have to look at what's going on in Russia. Chaos in Russia had led to revolution. Russia was the one great European power where the liberal ideas of the 19th century had made practically no headway. So the revolution that's taking place throughout the rest of Europe and Western Europe is not getting into Eastern Europe. In Russia, it doesn't come. So there's going to be some people not really happy about that. And then there's going to be some people that want to try to make sure that more of it doesn't get in. Nationalist bitterness against a government that appeared unable to win a battle was soon combined with protests in the cities over lack of bread and in the countryside over lack of land. So there's a lot of people not happy in Russia. Lack of effective government and the agitation of Lenin and his Bolsheviks led to the November Revolution of 1917. So here's another revolutionary movement that's come a little bit later than others, but it's come. Lenin immediately moved to set in motion his vast program of social reorganization, nationalizing all land and all banks, and placing factories in the hands of government-controlled trade unions. So a very different form of government is coming along in Russia as a result of what's happened over there, and it's going to make a big impact in world history for some time to come. As part of this program, all church property was also confiscated, so the church didn't fare well under communism. Thus, the Russian church, which had considered itself the third Rome after the fall of Byzantium, now found itself immersed in its own civil war against counter-revolutionaries who had both international and ecclesiastical support. So the Russian church is, long and the short of it is, it's being attacked, and it's going to have a hard time surviving as a result of what's happened here. By the time the Red Army had won the war, the Soviet government was more convinced than ever that the church was its mortal enemy. So the church in communist nations, for the most part, is not going to be looked favorably upon. It's going to be looked at as a negative thing, and most of the time, then it's going to be attacked as such. All right, well, that brings us now to World War II. And again, if the rest of this hadn't been familiar territory for you before now, you ought to be in a really familiar territory with this one. Fascism first gained prominence in Italy, but soon spread to Germany and other countries. The Nazi Party in Germany came into power in 1933 and eventually overshadowed Italian fascism. So this is what is going on politically throughout these countries. This new thinking, this fascist thinking, is going to come into several countries, and it's not going to be tenable. There's going to have to be a stop put to it as a result of what it ends up leading people to do. Through Nazi influence, anti-Semitism became part of the established dogma of international fascism and led to the death of millions of Jews. So we know one of the great evils in world history, and it's not the only one. There's been other examples of people trying to wipe out a whole other group of people, but this is the one that we know the best, and it's one that's looked back on and as being horrific, and it certainly was. By 1936, fascism had gained a measure of power in Japan, Poland, Austria, Hungary, Greece, Romania, and Bulgaria. That may not be as well known, but it was actually moving quite a bit outside of just a couple of nations earlier on, and eventually the fruit that's going to come as a result of that is going to be very much poisoned. In 1939, it became firmly established in Spain as well. Fascist attitudes towards Christianity varied. In Spain, the Catholic Church was considered an ally, so not going to be negatively looked at by those groups there in Spain, but in Italy, Mussolini's attitudes wavered according to various circumstances, so he may like the church or may not, depending on whether he thought it was helping him or not. Hitler felt that Christianity, with its teachings of universal love, was antagonistic to his ultimate goals of conquest and domination, but he sought to use the church to support those goals. So he's not really unlike a lot of the leaders that had come before him, in that they were willing to go along with whatever they needed to in religion and the church or what have you, if it was going to help them to achieve what they wanted. And in general, Hitler looked down on the church, but he also looked at it as if he could get it in the right hands, it could be used to help him, control people. And that's what he wanted to do. So he certainly wasn't going to promote it, but he also found a use for the church, and as a result, he hurt the church, and at least in Germany. And the church hurt itself by going along with him, at least for some of them. Germany and Italy joined forces in an axis to which Japan was later added. A month later, in September 1939, the world was once again at war. So these groups that have taken on this type of political system joined together with the idea of world conquest in mind. By the time the smoke cleared and the losses were calculated, it was clear that the cost of World War II had been enormous. An uncounted casualty of the war was the optimistic view of the future of Western civilization that had prevailed during the 19th century. That's all gone now. We've had two major wars that have sucked people in all throughout the world, and the wars are going to be long-reaching and going to lead to some very destructive weapons and to the most destructive weapon ever been made, and that is the nuclear bomb that actually demonstrated twice at the end of World War II. Well, you can imagine all these other countries are looking around thinking, okay, this is where Western civilization got us. I'm not thinking that's all that great. And, you know, as Western people, we see a lot different perspective. But if you kind of just step out of your own shoes and try on the shoes of maybe another group, think about what they've seen. Well, you know, at first we thought this was going to help us, but now we're starting to see we got sucked into something we didn't have any part in and don't care anything about. And it has not been anything but bad for us. And it's all because of these Western people coming in and taking us over. So this view of Western civilization being this great worldwide movement is now going to be looked at very, very differently. This was the civilization that, through a combination of Christianity and technical expertise, had been expected to bring about a new age for humankind. That's not what's going to be seen now. Now, through the two most devastating wars the world had ever known, this civilization had spread death and destruction throughout the world. And so we can probably maybe understand a little bit better, and not saying we agree with it, certainly we wouldn't, but understand a little bit better why around the world there became such a negative view of Western culture. And if you had to go through what some of the people had, if I had to go through that, if our nations had been taken over and then drug into war, we lost our dad or our mom or our brother or our sister, best friend, uncle, whoever it was, because these people couldn't get along about things we didn't care about, we would probably all look down on that too. So we kind of have to at least consider that that's not unrealistic to have that attitude. And it's prevailed to this day, as a matter of fact. So there are a lot of consequences that happen as a result of the events that we're looking at that are taking place through the 18th, 19th, 20th, and then into the 21st century. So let's look at some of those consequences. A direct consequence of all this was a worldwide revolt against colonialism in all its forms, and pretty obvious why they would do that with the way things went down. First, the colonial empires of the defeated nations were dismantled, but it soon became clear that even the victors had lost a great deal of prestige as a result of the war. In a span of 2 decades, every colonial empire was dismembered. So all the colonialism, the effects of it didn't go away, but the actual occupation went away. 20 years after the end of the war, there were also strong movements against economic imperialism in the poor nations. The colonialism went away, but the economic part of it didn't necessarily go away. And that was also, there was pushback on that too. At times, nationalism took the form of a resurgence of ancient non-Christian religions. One of the effects of all this was that anything associated with the West, the groups that had come in, a reaction against it was to try to get it out. It was bad. And with that went, in some cases, Christianity associated with it. So in some of these nations, one of the results of the nationalism that took effect was to go back to the ancient religions that had been in existence pre-Christian, or at least pre-Christianity coming into the area. And so this was more of a cultural movement against the Western occupation of countries, and unfortunately it led to a rejection of what they associated with those countries' Christianity. Some movements sought to change the social order of the nation itself, often following a socialist model. The first and largest of this trend was China, where the nationalist government was overthrown by the communists. Just a little word for any of those who are interested in socialism. Just go back in history and study how it went down anywhere that it's ever been tried, and you'll find that it is not good. Japan went the other way, seeking to compete with the older industrial nations of Europe and the United States by committing itself to capitalism. So Japan decided they're not going to go counter movement. They're going to actually embrace the groups that had come in. And, it makes sense. The Japanese are smart people. The group takes you over, if you can't beat them, join them type of deal. And they saw the advantages of what the West had accomplished and wanted that for themselves. And so that's the way they chose to handle it. Almost all of Africa and the Muslim world became independent of Western political rule. In the Muslim world, this led to radical and violent forms of Islam coming to the foreground. By the 21st century, these were causing grave concern not only among Western nations, but also in the Muslim world itself. And we all probably are pretty familiar with some of the bad effects of that. In the United States and the European industrialized nations, a Cold War between capitalist and communist nations began immediately after World War II. In some areas, such as in Korea and Vietnam, the Cold War erupted into open hostility. And we certainly know about those hostilities because they also involved wars that the Western powers were a part of. But the later decade of the 20th century brought about the unexpected fall of communism in Eastern Europe and the dismemberment of the Soviet Union. So all these consequences coming from what we have seen happening through the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries are going to have big effects on the church. And so having looked at all of that, the historical information, now is the time to see, or at least in a very broad way, look at some things that each one of these is going to mean for the church and its development throughout this period of time. Throughout all of these situations and many others, the church was present. So obviously things we've discussed today are going to affect the church. More than any international organization, corporation, or political movement, the church cut across national boundaries, class distinctions, and political allegiances. The great legacy of the 19th century was that for the first time in history, a truly universal church had been born. And the reason for that was the spread of the church throughout the world because of the spread of the civilization that had the church. And while, again, we're not going to get into the political stuff or even social commentary to that extent, but you can look at it as being a good thing or a bad thing. And not making any comment on that one way or the other. People have valid reasons for both sides. But in what happened, God knew what was coming. And the truth of the Word of God, the truth of the gospel spread. And it spread in a way that was unprecedented. And because of that, the church was established in all of the nations of the world. And I know you can look at some groups that it wasn't, but you've got Christianity spread in a way that it never had before. And so now you've got a universal church and not just in one culture. The missionaries of earlier generations had succeeded. After their passing, they left behind a vast network of Christians of every culture, color, and nationality. And it still exists today. To such an international church, the issues of the 21st century were not simple. So when you have a great variety and diversity of people from different cultures and different parts of the world, these issues are not necessarily going to be looked at the same way. And that's going to create some complexity. It's going to create some issues and problems. Especially in the poor countries of the world, there were those who were convinced that their Christian faith required that they be involved in liberating people from economic and social oppression. And you can understand why. They're looking at that as a very real thing, not something that they read about in a textbook that happened in the past, but what they're experiencing now. And they want their faith, and the worldview that they have as a result of being Christians is that every part of their life be affected by their Christianity and by what they believe and what is right and just and how you should treat people. Obviously, they're going to be concerned about those that are being oppressed. And so in a very real way, you've got that point of view, but that's not the only point of view. There are also those who insisted that this was not the task of the church, that those things were important, but it's not the church's role to do that. And there's arguments for both sides. Again, we're not going to get into that. Many turned to fundamentalism, which often was allied to political and economic conservatism. Others went the other way to progressivism, which was allied with political and economic liberalism. So one of the things we found in Western culture, and certainly in the United States, is that while there is a separation of church and state, people have willingly allied different religious points of view with political points of view. So a conservative side or fundamentalist side might be on one end of the political spectrum, and obviously then the more progressive churches and progressive theology is going to ally itself with the other side. So you've got a melding once again of the political and the religious world, but this isn't forced. And so, in one sense, you can look at that and say, well, that's not great. In another sense, you can look at it and say, well, what that is people are allowing, or naturally, what they believe is the most important thing in life to affect everything about their lives. And so their beliefs as Christians, their religious beliefs are going to definitely affect what they believe about politics and other things. So again, you can look at it as being a negative. You can also look at it in a different light as well. And as with these other things, there's going to be validity both ways. In the West, the church lost much of the political power and cultural prestige it had once held. In this post-Constantinian era, the church no longer had the support of the state and its institutions. So one side of the separation of church and state is that the church lost what it had earlier enjoyed, and what, when Constantine came in, the people in the church and leadership wanted, which was the state to help it out, to give validity to it, to even give a sense of power to it. And now that that's gone, that part, the part that, may be looked at as being beneficial, left with it. And so that's going to change the way people see the church and the culture. This loss of power and prestige went far beyond political matters, extending to the cultural and the social. And so it's not going to just be the political things. It's also going to be the way you look at your culture, the way you look at society, and the way people in the culture and in society look at the church. And so the church lost some standing there as well. By the beginning of the 21st century, it was clear that the impact of the church and its teaching on the daily life of Western Europeans and North Americans was waning. And it's sad to say that, but it's true. You can look up any number of statistics that I could roll out there, and you can say what you want about it, but that's just the fact of the way that it is. As attendance at church services declined, Christianity was virtually absent or ignored by most forms of mass media and in much of social and family life. So definitely a huge change from the way things had been for so long. While a main contributing factor for the decline was secularism, there were also other factors. Gnosticism, dealt with by the church in the distant past, saw a revival. Others turned to astrology or to spiritism or to magical practices. Many simply gathered bits from a variety of sources and constructed their own personalized religion. And really, that last part is very indicative of the way many people in Western culture are today. They haven't outright rejected God or Christianity or religion or the spiritual, but they've rejected any one point of view on it. And what they've decided is that they'll take kind of a cafeteria line approach to it and just kind of pick and choose the parts that they like and want and cobble something together that works for them. And so it's very much it's very different. It's not even any one religion. You might take some out of Buddhism that you like, some out of Hinduism, some from Islam, some from Christianity. And the prevailing thought with that is, well, after all, we're all kind of going to the same point. If you look at a mountain, there's a peak to it. You're traveling to the peak, but you might be on any side of it. And regardless of what side you walk up, you end up in the same place. Now, that doesn't work because these religions typically are pretty exclusive. Some of them are, but many of them are. And Christianity certainly is completely exclusive. There is no place for other religious approaches in Christianity. There's no place for validity to them. And you can't be a follower of Jesus Christ and then also follow another religion. Jesus himself said that he was the only way. No man came to the Father except through him. And so that doesn't work, and yet that's the way that we have seen our culture turn. And we're going to get through this section. Remember, this is just kind of very broad brushstrokes of what's coming. We're going to look at the reasons why that happened. So let's finish out today by looking at just a few more things about the church at this time. The intellectual challenges were no less daunting. Modernity had drastically changed the worldview of most people in traditional Christendom. Ancient authorities, including the Bible, were questioned as never before. Let me just stop real quick and talk about this term, which is actually the title of this section. Christendom doesn't mean Christianity as a whole. It means the Christianity that became institutionalized in the West in such a way that it was actually a melding of culture, of politics, of everything. So it's a kingdom of Christianity that was a Western thing. And that is what the title of this is, beyond that. We're moved beyond that now. There's some really difficult things about that, but there are also some good things about that. So that's what it means here. And, you read this and you think, well, I don't think we're living in a post-Christian world or a post-Christian society. And you get defensive about that, thinking, well, that means that Christianity is no longer a real thing here. And that's not what this is talking about. It's the way that Christianity became ingrained in the political and the cultural to the extent that it did. And that part is over with. And it's not going to ever come back. At least probably not in anybody's lifetime that's listening to this. So in that sense, I think you probably agree with this. Darwin and his theory of evolution became a symbol of the intellectual and doctrinal challenges of the time. But then the failures of modernity were such that people began speaking of postmodern period. So move now from the modern times that people looked at and said, well, that didn't work out so well. So now we're in the postmodern world, which I've never really understood what that meant. If modern means what we're at now, how can we be past it? But anyway, I know there's a clear definition for that. It's just, to me, that term's kind of dumb. In the field of theology, there was a pendulum swing in which both Protestant and Catholic theologians moved away from their former extremes. Protestants became generally more skeptical about the achievements and promise of modernity, and Catholics acknowledged some of its values and contributions. So just kind of a difference of point of view that developed throughout this time. Other momentous changes were taking place in the life of the church. For much of the history of Christianity, there were regions of the world that considered themselves Christian. In these areas, the church generally held significant political and social power. But the most important event in the history of Christianity in the 19th and 20th century was that it moved beyond its traditional confines within Western civilization and became a truly universal faith. So let me go back to that first part. So the idea that a nation is a Christian nation, that's kind of gone away with, or a people are a Christian people. You still hear it. People talk about America being a Christian nation. It's not. And the majority of people in America are Christians. They're not. They may say that they are, and maybe in some sense they are, but as far as really actually practicing traditional Christianity, that's gone. And that's really not the way it is in the world anymore. It's changed now. But the second part is the exciting part, and that is that worldwide Christianity is actually flourishing in many places. It may not be in the same places that it once did, but it's been freed from a lot of the cultural things that kind of weighed it down from the time of Constantine up. And now it's able to flourish in a way that we haven't seen pre-Constantine really in other countries. And it's pretty exciting to see what's going on. We'll talk more about that as we go through this. Even as colonialism began to ebb in many of the former colonial lands, Christianity continued to grow, to put down roots, and to find new forms and expressions better adapted to the cultural and social landscapes of each region. So while in these regions we talked about Western ideas were being rejected, colonialism was being rejected, get it out of here, many of the people did go back to former religions. Not everybody did. The one thing that did survive was Christianity, but it didn't survive in the form in which it came into. the country, which was very much influenced by Western ideas. It started to adapt to the area in which it was introduced and the ways that people thought there. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that that's theological differences or there's some, big change that would be, you would say, well, that's no longer Christian. It's just the way that it's being applied. And that's the way Christianity's always been. It's always adapted to the places that it's gone to in order to reach people. And that's happening in other countries now. Thus, during the 19th and early 20th centuries, Christianity moved beyond Christendom in the spatial sense. So it's actually physically moved. But Christianity is moving beyond Christendom in the temporal sense also. In 1900, 94.5% of Europeans and 96.6% of North Americans were Christians. By 2000, those numbers declined to 76.8% and 84.2%. So in that span of time, it's gone down significantly. You're talking about 100 years. That, you look at those numbers, well, they're still the majority. Yeah, technically. But are those people cultural? Are they really practicing Christianity? You got to knock the numbers down for that anyway. And the trend, though, is the thing. It's steadily declining and significantly declining more and more. Is that, barring God really doing something extraordinary, which he certainly could do, that trend is probably not going to stop. In contrast, in Africa, 9.2% of the population were Christian in 1900, but by 2000, the figure was 45.9%. So that was a huge leap up, much greater leap up than the leap down that we've seen in the Western world. So in Africa, Christianity is on the rise. In Asia, it's not going to be as extreme, but still pretty good. In Asia, the numbers were 2.3% Christian in 1900 and 8.5% in 2000. So a big jump up there too. So think what you want to about Christianity. It's waning. It's on its way out. Maybe in some places, but not everywhere. God is at work in this world, and he is doing things in places that maybe we don't know about, maybe we don't hear about so much. But he is at work. He is moving. He is touching and changing lives. And that's exciting, for ourselves. And looking at our own culture, it's sad to see that Christianity is losing the effect that it once did and people leaving it. And it's not to say that you should just say that's inevitable. We should certainly be contending for the faith and constantly doing so. But God is not just stopped. He is at work. And it's exciting to see that in other parts of the world, our brothers and sisters are growing in leaps and bounds. And often these are places that have undergone persecution. Well, what have we learned throughout this entire study? Whenever things are easy, that's when problems come up. That's when Christians start seeing a bunch of people come in that really aren't that committed. There begins to be a bunch of arguments, a bunch of schisms, a bunch of breaks. Is that not what we've seen throughout Christianity since the time of Constantine? It really has. People can't handle peacefulness. They just don't do well with it. But what happens when it's persecuted? It thrives. So in these nations in which Christianity is not the predominant religion, and in many cases being heavily persecuted, some even to the point of death, we see Christianity is flourishing. And that's the way it's always been, and that's the way it is now. The numeric decline of Christianity in the old centers of Christendom were more than balanced by explosive growth in areas where a century earlier the presence of Christianity was minimal. So worldwide, Christianity is not going down. It's at least balanced, if not on the rise, and certainly on the rise significantly, depending on where you're at. Christianity has moved beyond Christendom in the West. It's moved beyond what it used to be. The time of the Constantinian fusion of church and state and between Christian faith and cultural and social practices has passed. That's good about the church and state being separate. It's not so great that it doesn't have the effect that it did in the culture anymore, although a lot of that was forced. So, in some ways, being beyond Christendom is actually something to praise God for. In other ways, we know that we've lost a lot, and we've lost a lot of people actually wanting to listen to what the Word of God says and the people that represent it, unfortunately. So that's sad, but there's been good parts of it too. We have entered a new period of history in which the North Atlantic is no longer the center of Christianity, and that is absolutely the way that things stand now, and probably are going to continue to be that way. So this was a very broad brush look at these topics. Again, there's a lot in here. There may be even stuff you disagree with, and that's fine, but it's actually very necessary because we have to understand what the world's going to be like in the development of the way Christianity is heading in order to understand why it got to where it is. And it has very much to do with the way things developed in the West and then as Christianity moved out to other places. So thanks for taking time with me once again today. Pray that you'll be able to come back next week and we'll continue our study, as we just have a few weeks to go now, about 12, 13 weeks or so, and we'll finish this out. So if you've hung with me this long, stick with me and we'll finish things off, and I think you'll really enjoy what's coming. So until that time, hope that you have a great week, and God bless.